Hello and welcome to this month's drawing tutorial. I'm Sharon Gray and this month we're going to work on how to draw metal. So here's the still life that I have set up, and I'm going to draw the fork and the spoon on the drawing paper right underneath. So we're going to have a few challenges. There's the texture of the metal. How do you make it look like metal when you're working in graphite? There's the precise lines, and there's the matter of perspective to keep in mind. I'll begin the drawing the same way I always do, with the largest shapes that I see. So first of all, the shape of the tines on that fork. Just sketch out the basic angle of the handle here. Obviously I'm not concerned about making those lines precise at this point. Very good, and then I'll do the same thing with the spoon. Notice how I give myself an end point, and then I attach the handle of the spoon within the guidelines. As I sketch, I'm not just putting things down blindly, I'm continually checking where the spoon lines up in terms of the fork. So the bottom of the spoon and the bowl of the fork here should be in pretty good alignment. I need to make mine come out a little bit more so that the spoon comes out to about here. The base of the spoon here and the handle of the fork right here, those need to be in alignment. And I'm also looking for the negative shapes of the space between the fork and spoon. Looking for those negative shapes will help me to double check my proportions and the closeness of the spoon to the fork, as well as the angle. So let me take just a few minutes off camera and clean up this rough, get it to the point where I'm ready to shade, and then I'll come back to you. Now once your outline is nice and clean, then you can start to protect your whites. The reflection is obviously incredibly important, so for these little tiny places I'm going to scratch in my lights. And you'll notice that I erased the line first, and that's so that indentation will show up really nicely. Here are the tips of the tines. It's really small. I'm just pressing in. Drawing metal is a little more tricky than painting it because you can't just paint those whites in. You need to either draw around them or protect them before you start. For larger spaces like the highlight here, where the light is hitting the bowl, I'm going to have to work around it. So I'm giving myself a light indication for where those shadows are going to be, and then I'm just going to use an H pencil on the side, and using smooth strokes I'll fill in the base tone. When you're looking at metal, you'll see that there are several different layers. There's not exactly a mid-tone the way you can look for on flesh, or something that's not quite so reflective. So you have to pay really close attention and make sure that you're matching what you see. So see how I'm just carefully filling this in. Now on the handle of the spoon, there's kind of a brushed metal. So to get that, I'm going to carefully indent tiny little speckles. And those will show up as the highlights around each raised tiny piece of metal on that handle, and create the texture that I'm looking for. Consider this stage of shading an extension of the drawing phase. I'm mapping out where those shadows are going to go. I'm not putting them in precisely the way they look quite yet. This way I'll still have a chance to make some modifications, erase out some vital highlights. I want to have covered them up before I establish very firmly where they're supposed to go. Because it can get confusing, especially when you're dealing with something that has a tricky texture like metal, and then also the shadows that it's casting as well. You get lost between the substance and the shadows, and all of a sudden you don't really know where you are in the form anymore. So the shading will help things to be clearer. Now after I have added one pass of shading with the pencil, I'm going to go back and smooth that out very carefully here like this, using the stomp or tortillon. This is obviously going to have to become much darker, but remember what I just said. I'm just mapping out the basic shapes of those shadows now. I'm going to work this way and get the fork up to the same level, and then I'll come back and show you how to add the darker shadows and pick out some highlights that weren't preserved. Once you have your base coat established, then you can do more work pulling out the little highlights. But see, then I can just zoop, pick out some of those little bitty white flecks that give the metal some definition. And then what's going to make the big difference is going in with those dark, precise detail lines. So for that, I'm going to go up to a 2B or something even softer, get the tip nice and sharp on a piece of sandpaper, and then look for the darkest shapes and lines and very carefully put those in. Around the edge of metal, the light is going to take unevenly, so make a broken line around the edge, and that will help it look like there are some highlights here and there. And then as I fill in this edge, I'm not going to make it all uniformly dark. There are areas of very, very dark, and then even within that shadow edge, there are some edges that there are some points of the shadow that aren't as dark. And here and there where you need a really precise mechanical line, I'm going to use a straight edge to put in some of those dark shadow shapes, and that will add to the realism more than anything else, because that will make this look mechanical. But what you're going to find is that shading metal comes down to close observation. Notice on this raised pattern on the spoon, there's an outer edge where that pattern catches the light. On one side you have a highlight, and on the other is dark shadow. So use broken lines, use straight edge where necessary, be very observant, work slowly, and look for those shadow shapes. I'm going to be doing that off camera, and then I'm going to come back and show you how this looks with more details put in the darks. Now you can see what the metal looks like after adding some of those more intense darks. You can see also that I've added some of the shadows underneath the fork and the spoon, and then you can just carefully take your eraser and blot out around the shadow so that the inner core is the darkest place. Shadows are darkest at the source, so for instance here under the spoon, where the spoon is closest to the shadow, it's going to be the darkest intensity. So I have a core of shadow right in the center of these tines, and then I'll use my kneaded eraser to make the diffused shading on either side of that core. So drawing metal is just a process of protecting your whites, using a straight edge whenever you can to get those mechanical lines, and then carefully picking out reflections within the shadows and building up your darks and lights just like you do with anything else. But drawing metal in a controlled environment and working on just one or two small, fairly simple objects is the way to start building up your competence in realistic drawing of metal. So that concludes our drawing tutorial. Let's move on to our painting tutorial for the month.